Now to the US, where a second coming of Donald Trump as president is still on the cards. We caught up with a former Trump Africa ambassador, J.PETER PHAM, and I started by asking him how a second Trump administration might approach the continent.
Well, I think to put it into context, Martine, and thanks for this opportunity to speak with you, I think it's important to bear in mind that for all the attention that's paid to personalities and to parties, really since the end of the Cold War, there's been great continuity in U.S. Africa policy. Part of that's a function of, let's be realistic, I'm a political realist. And part of it is that the focus on Africa uh, within U.S. foreign policy is generally almost a boutique occupation. And so it's a small group of people who actually pay attention, who follow the issues. So the policy is largely continuous. If you look at, for example, trade policy, uh, AGOA was introduced with bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans during the Clinton administration, renewed and expanded in the George W. Bush administration, renewed once again with vast bipartisan support under Obama. So there's a lot of continuity, and I would expect that historic pattern to remain as it has during the transition from Obama to Trump and to Biden and to whether we go to Trump or Harris. Now, what happens is accents may change or individual personalities may change in policy roles, but by and large, a great deal of the policy is continuous, and I would expect that to continue.
Is a second Trump administration likely to recognise the importance that is virtually consensually agreed now on the strategic minerals that are within African territory and how important they are for American national security, which of course was a big part of the Biden administration's policy towards Africa?
Well, and I would say that Biden policy, by the way, was built upon steps that were undertaken during the Trump administration. I was the special envoy for the Great Lakes region when we laid the basis through our assiduous work on ensuring that the Democratic Republic of Congo had its first peaceful transition of power in its 6-decade history. Uh, Secretary Mike Pompeo visited Angola, laying the groundwork for what has been arguably the Biden administration's largest investment in Africa, the Lobito corridor from Angola through the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zambia and perhaps beyond in future years. So again, that note of continuity will continue. Now, accents will change, engagements will change, personnel will change, and in some respects, I would make the argument, I don't say this because I'm a Republican, uh, I say this as a political analyst. Actually, if you look at the post Cold War history of U.S. engagement with Africa, it's actually been under Republican administrations that Africa actually has gotten the major programming, and that has to do with internal American politics and who gets appointed to posts and why. And we can get into that, but actually, many of the great gains have occurred under Republican administrations.
And Patrick?
Ambassador Pham, you mentioned the Lobito corridor and critical mineral competition. Right now, we've got a situation where the US has embarked on the Lobito corridor to the Zambian copper belt from the Angola coastline, is now talking about a line going the other way from from the copper belt to East Africa, to the Indian Ocean. China is already there, both on the Lobito to Congo link, and now last week at the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, Xi Jinping announced the rehabilitation of the Tazara Railway. I mean, do you think that both these routes are commercially viable?
I think certainly the Lobito Corridor, as it currently stands now, some people talk about extending it to the Indian Ocean. I'm not so sure about that, whether that would be commercially viable. But certainly the build up through Angola. Remember, the interesting thing and the difference, and this is, I think, the key difference between what the Lobito Corridor represents and what its future integrated corridors. It's the first, but it's not going to be the only one that America is going to involve. So has to do with the integration. China builds infrastructure in order to export primary commodities. That's very, very different from building an integrated corridor that not only permits export, but also builds energy, transfers energy, enables and empowers value added processing to occur in Africa and allows African countries to realize the dream of capturing more of the value chain.
Peter, Trump is known to be an elitist generally, and he has been quoted as having described African countries as shithole countries. How do you think he's going to get along with this continent for which he has a thinly veiled contempt?
Well, it's funny you say elitist because I think it's a matter of perspective. In American politics, most people would describe him, whether they like him or not, more as a populist than an elitist. So I think it's all a matter of perspective. But the key thing is who is, you know, at the end of the day, we have to be political realists. And in political reality is Africa policy for decades in administrations, both Democrat and Republican, has never been a top priority at the very top of American policymaking.
There's a big difference between not being that interested, which none of them are. I totally agree with you. I mean, not even our beloved Obama visited Nigeria, the giant of Africa. And Kamala and Biden haven't shown a great interest in Africa either. But there's a difference between being not that interested and being actively contemptuous.
I'm not sure even about the active. One comment, attributed comment, and lack of attention. In the end of the day, what's important is policy that's actually made and implemented, and that occurs at a much different level. And as I've said, one could argue that the major accomplishments of U.S. policy toward Africa, whether it be PEPFAR, which has invested, well over $100 billion in African healthcare, AGOA, and other programs, Millennium Challenge, what's going on now with the Lobito Corridor and other investments in energy and infrastructure have all been carried out at a different level. And one could argue, and I would argue, the historical record has been that actually, and this goes to how internally appointments are made, have been more effective in Republican administrations. Republican administrations tend to put political appointees in charge of policy in Africa. The Democratic administrations tend to put career appointees. And the difference between that is that the political appointees actually are people who are interested in these jobs, are interested in these roles, have often long engagements with Africa, and because they're political appointees, they can break through some of the obstacles and get things done. Many of the, as we see, currently, many of the career appointees may have some career background in it, but the fact is, because they're not political appointees, they're unable to break through to the real decision makers, and in fact, are often delayed in their policy making, thus less effectual as actually policy implementers.
I mean, you've pointed out that what you consider to be a virtual consistency in terms of US policy to Africa, but under the last Trump presidency, he was noted particularly for abrupt shifts in virtually on every point of established American policy. In terms of relationships with the multilateral institutions, the breaking with traditional allies, and the cozying up, if you like, with the traditional adversaries. Is that something, do you think, that the world should be bracing itself for, on the continent in particular?
Well, we're talking about Africa, not the world. Certainly in the world, there's been shakeup, and what I would make the argument that some of that shakeup was necessary. The former Secretary General of NATO, for example, has during the NATO summit in July, credited Trump for actually pushing more of the NATO countries to spend what they had committed more than a decade ago on military spending. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a bull in the china shop to get things done.
Peter, what about the advisors to the Trump campaign, including this Project 2025, which are really calling for a US to de-link from the multilateral system, perhaps leaving the UN system, defunding Bretton Woods, World Bank and IMF. Do you think that is just campaign bluster, or do you think there's a serious intent that should Donald Trump be re-elected in November, that his administration would go ahead and cut ties drastically with the multilateral system?
Well, I think that President Trump himself and official representatives of the campaign have been very clear that Project 2025 is not the campaign. It was a large coalition of conservative groups that got together and put together this 920-page book, which varied from chapter to chapter. Full disclosure, I co-chaired the Africa group, and you can read those 400 words in there if you haven't. And I don't think you can, there's much in there that any of the three of you would disagree with.
Joe Biden has, perhaps rather late in the day in terms of his presidency, has committed himself to Africa in a way not seen in recent years. He's had the Africa Business Summit in May. He's hosted William Ruto as in the first state visit for over 15 years for an African leader. You've mentioned the Lobito corridor investment. Do you think that a Kamala Harris administration will maintain that level of engagement with Africa, or do you think that might fall by the wayside?
Well, I think the overall line of policy, irrespective of the results of our November election, will continue. But I do think that if the current pattern of appointments remains what it is, you will get some, implementation issues. I mean, the Biden administration has been good with what I call showcase events. The U.S. Africa Leader Summit at the end of 2022, visits and of high-level officials around. But when it gets to implementation, even on signature projects, it runs into, and again, this has little to do with Africa, much more to do with internal American dynamics and things like the power of the public sector employees unions in America, implementation. So a lot of it, what I say to my African friends is, it's not about you, it's a lot more about us. The Development Finance Corporation started with all the best intentions, wide bipartisan support, virtually no votes against it, signed into law by President Trump in 2018. And yet 5 years later, what do we find? Less than half of the capital authorized by Congress has been committed, much less dispersed.
Ambassador J.PETER PHAM, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.